You're listening to The Luxury Item, the podcast on the business of luxury and the people and companies that are shaping the future of the luxury industry. Here's your host, Scott Kerr.
The COVID-19 crisis has hit the luxury and fashion industry hard. Sales in these two sectors could drop by 25 to 30% compared to 2019. The economic and health crisis could also have long-term repercussions on purchasing behavior, trends, and trigger tremendous changes in the luxury field. My guest today on the Luxury Item podcast has a less doom and gloom view on the future of luxury. In fact, in his new book, Future Luxe, What Lies Ahead for the Business of Luxury, he paints a brighter future of where the luxury sector is headed and identifies where the growth opportunities will be. Erwan Rambourg has been a top-ranked analyst covering the luxury and sporting goods sectors for 15 years. After 8 years as a marketing manager in the luxury industry, notably for LVMH and Richemont, he is now HSBC's Managing Director and Global Head of Consumer and Retail Equity Research. This isn't the first time Erwan has written about the luxury business. In 2014, he wrote a book called The Bling Dynasty, Why the Reign of Chinese Luxury Shoppers Has Only Just Begun. He regularly contributes to the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, CNBC, and Bloomberg, and has guest lectured at top universities all around the world. Welcome to the Luxury Item, Erwan.
Thanks for having me.
Congratulations on your new book. Very exciting, Future Luxe. But, it's not the first time you've been around the block with a book. In your book from 6 years ago, The Bling Dynasty, you talked about Chinese consumers being more important than ever for your brand as they were on track to dominate the industry over the next decade by an enormous margin. Talking about nailing that one, and this was 6 years ago, right now, China's the only bright spot in the luxury industry these days, and the demand for luxury goods is projected to grow as much, I think it's like 30% this year in China, while the rest of the world is shrinking by 45%. What did you see in the, back then?
Well, I think over time you've had consistently misplaced fears. Every time there's a crisis, whether it's, following the appointment of Xi Jinping or whether it's, just a few years back where you had stress around tariffs and trade, you have this tendency of investors to think that for some reason it's the end of Chinese luxury consumption. And there's still a lot of Chinese consumers to recruit. And to your point, the growth this year will be tremendous, partly artificially because you have a repatriation of growth. No one's able to travel these days. So the Chinese consumer staying at home and she's buying at home. But beyond that, sort of mechanical, artificial element, you have proper consumer confidence on the high end. I think speaking to a lot of people based in Shanghai and elsewhere in China about COVID-19 and how they're experiencing it, many will tell you it's a vague negative souvenir. I'm based in New York. Obviously, it'll be difficult for me to describe it that way. So I think there's a combination of pretty good confidence in the way this crisis has been dealt with by the authorities. And beyond that, obviously, a lot of wealth creation in China, the repatriation of growth, short-term boosting figures. But you're right. I think if you leave aside the Chinese consumer this year, there's not a lot to play for in luxury, with the possible exception of the American consumer. I have to say that recently we've seen a better pickup than expected in the US as well.
Any particular part of the US and what part of the luxury sector?
I would say it's pretty much across the board, and there are several reasons for it. I think historically you had a good correlation between equity markets and luxury demand in this country, and equity markets are right now close to all-time highs. And you've had the reality of staycationing, so people not traveling to Europe as they usually do over the summer, not spending on flights and hotels and fancy restaurants because a lot of them are closed. And so you've had what some economists and the Biden campaign have referred to as the K-shaped recovery. So people who are not that well off ahead of the crisis or even worse off, but people who are doing well, they're actually feeling pretty emboldened. And if they happen to have a secondary home, the value of that home has probably gone up. And I think there's a big difference relative to the sort of post 9/11 crisis where, there was a guilt factor. It was seen as inappropriate to purchase luxury. even vulgar at some stage. I don't think that's the sentiment at all. I think wealthy individuals in the US are happy to come back and spend. There's a bit of a, what some people called a survival trade. I've lived through this for the past 6 months. I've survived it. I'm allowed to reward myself. This is the time to come back. And so even logo heavy products, counterintuitively, seem to be coming back strong in the US.
So how did Future Luxe come about? I mean, you must have started writing it before COVID hit. And how has the pandemic impacted those trends you predicted?
Yeah, so indeed, I did write the bulk of at least the first draft pre-COVID-19, looking at lots of changes in the industry, looking at M&A consolidation, and looking at the need to move to the next phase for what has maybe been a bit of a complacent sector. I think because you've had really good growth, high margins, great cash generation, you've had a lot of managers who were maybe resting a bit on their laurels. And I had the view that you needed a bit of a kicker. It could well be that COVID-19 gave you the sort of catalyst for change that might have been needed. And so, as I said, I wrote the bulk pre-COVID, but I rewrote, if I can say, a lot of the parts of the book post-COVID, and finalized the book just ahead of the summer. And I think COVID brings about a lot of acceleration. It's not as if I had added a chapter or subtracted a chapter, but some of the trends I had identified are just going to take place in a much shorter period of time. So some of those trends include, localization. So I was talking about repatriation of growth in China, the fact that you should target local consumers and consider that tourism flows are the cherry on the cake. They're not the cake. Digitalization, for example, which was much needed. A need probably also to reinvent retail, to make it more exciting, to rethink the stores. And then maybe a fourth element, which is again, consolidation. You've had a lot of M&A over the past 10 years. I think right now, with COVID-19 still being prevalent, and you're seeing, the resurgence of cases in parts of Europe, in some states in the US. But once we're done with this, I think consolidation M&A will resume, and that will also accelerate, linked to the gradual weakness of the small independent players relative to the bigger groups.
Yeah, I think you said in something I read that the family-controlled luxury brands will be merging or selling their assets, not because they have to, but because they understand that it's probably the better solution for their name to still be around in 30 years' time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you don't have forced sellers in the branded space, at least, and you don't have a lot of brands being at risk of going bust, which will be different if you're looking at retailers. But if you're looking at the luxury brands themselves, they could probably all survive. They might be loss-making this year, or at least in the first half of this year, but they will probably muddle through and survive. But surviving is obviously not the end goal.
Right.
I think indeed, if you are family controlled and if you want your asset to be in bright lights over the next generation or two, you might come to the conclusion that being backed by a bigger group that has greater financial means could be a good thing. Imagine you're a small independent company in crowded spaces like footwear or ready-to-wear or handbags. If you're the number 23 handbag company and you're small and isolated, I think you don't have the deep pockets that are required. And scale actually matters because luxury remains essentially a recruitment industry. It's not about repeat purchases. Obviously, if you can make consumers loyal, that's a good thing. But the starting point is the vast majority of sales are still made with first-time purchasers. And if that's the case, your capacity to outspend others is key. And so if you just go back to the handbag example, if you're in the market of my first branded handbag, the likelihood is you'll go to one of the top three. You'll go to Gucci, you'll go to Chanel, you'll go to Louis Vuitton. If you have more means, you might consider Hermès. If you're edgier, you might consider Dior or potentially Prada. But outside of that sort of pack of 5 or 6 go-to brands, it's going to be a lot more difficult to emerge. And so again, being backed by a bigger group that has means to invest behind you can probably secure the long-term future and relevance of your brand.
And it also seems that some of these family-controlled luxury brands, some of the smaller ones who had not invested as much in e-commerce before COVID hit, could also be left behind and just be very vulnerable to the larger players.
Yeah, I think, I shouldn't be saying this, but I used to work in the industry, and that was a while ago. And at the time, we didn't really know who we were selling to, right? And we didn't need to know, because the growth was such that it was more about, can I actually produce enough? Than do I fully know who I'm selling to? That era is over. You are looking at a much more competitive space. You have to have a keen knowledge of who you're actually selling to, what drives her motivation. And I think that, that's part of digitalization. It's part of systems, CRM systems. If you walk into a Montclair store, they will know who you are. They will know that you were there 6 months before. They will know that your son is turning 12, next October on the 15th, and that his favorite color is green, and that level of knowledge is clearly not widespread within smaller brands who don't necessarily have the means to invest in those systems. But again, it will differentiate the level of service, the level of attention, and your illusion as a consumer that you're being treated like someone who's absolutely exceptional. It's a sort of, I think it's fair to say that you don't have scarcity in luxury, scarcity of product. If you leave aside maybe Patek Philippe or maybe Hermès or one or two other brands, it's not about scarcity. It's about giving you the illusion of scarcity. You are someone special. We are selling something special to you. And the way we're communicating is just for you. You need to live under that illusion of a bespoke product, a bespoke experience, a bespoke communication to you. And again, the bigger groups will have the financial means to step up in terms of systems and in terms of knowledge. Knowledge is power, with the consumer. Right. And if you don't really know your consumer that well, you're going to struggle.
Right off the bat in the first chapter of your book, it's titled "The Future is Female." Women are already driving somewhere like between 70 and 80% of all consumer spending. And we know they're the chief decision maker in the household, and that will continue to intensify. So with with the female spending power on the cusp of becoming much greater, how do you think luxury brands should start shaping their strategies now?
Yeah, so I think when to your point, the chapter is called "The Future is Female." I got a bit of pushback from people saying, well, the past was female and the present is female, which is fair. But the reason I'm saying the future is female is that because of what Shinzo Abe in Japan would have called womenomics, you are seeing salary gaps tend to narrow between men and women. You're seeing the participation rate in terms of employment going higher. You're seeing people getting married later, having fewer kids, or if they're having kids, having them later. So it will free up a lot of spending. Now, this will obviously be at a great advantage for female-driven businesses. In luxury, you can think about jewelry, cosmetics, handbags, and accessories. But way beyond that, it's going to influence a lot of subsectors. And one example I put in that chapter is an interview of an entrepreneur in spirits, on purpose, because spirits traditionally has been very male-driven. You could argue quite macho in terms of its communication. And I think, again, if 80% of household spending is driven by women, even spirits, which comes across as being a male-dominated industry, will be influenced by women. I think there's also a real contradiction between luxury spending being 75, 80% female-driven and the organization of management teams within the industry. It's surprising that the bulk of decision makers within the luxury industry are usually men, usually white, usually in their 50s or 60s.
Yeah, I think you called it an embarrassment.
It is a bit embarrassing. It is a bit of there's a clear dichotomy between the demographics of management within the sector and the target market. The target market is mostly young, mostly female, mostly diverse, mostly Asian. So, I think you're going to have a lot of changes in terms of the management team. I just think the metrics will force you to look again at who develops the brand, who is influential, within the companies. And I do believe you will see younger managers, you will see more diverse managers, and hopefully, essentially, you'll see more women. And you have a lot of, it's not that you can really fall behind an excuse of we don't have the quality of managers on the female side. That's wrong. You have a lot of very high quality managers that are female and that can run a lot of businesses in this industry.
Yeah, I think in your book you predicted in the next 10 years, the majority of the board members and at least 25% of the brand CEOs will be female. And that, that certainly will be great. We're seeing right now that the number of women running Fortune 500 companies recently hit a new high, and I'll put that in quotation marks, like 37 up from a 33.
Right.
While that's kind of like a small victory, it's still a very small percentage. So what do you think has to change in these companies to get to that 25%?
Well, I think a lot of, again, the changes that needed to happen pre-COVID are going to happen now because it's a bit of a wake-up call. It's a bit like in digitalization. There's this ongoing joke around, who really transformed your company technologically. Was it your chief of IT? Was it your CEO? And the answer is neither. It was COVID-19. So, again, a lot of complacency in the sector, a lot of people being happy with themselves. Suddenly a huge, unprecedented crisis makes you rethink. And so that's why I'm an eternal optimist, because I think that there are a lot of silver linings in the COVID-19 crisis. And there is a realization that, you're seeing now the groups in the sector appoint diversity and inclusion managers. You're seeing a lot of groups in the sector appoint more and more female managers at higher senior levels. I think it is happening as we speak, actually. I think it is ongoing. I think there's a lot of pressure to do the right thing. And I think what COVID-19 also has taught you is that it's important to have good products, but it's important to come across as a good corporate citizen. At the end of the day, consumers don't just buy products. They don't just buy logos. They buy your values. They buy your trustworthiness. They buy the fact that you share a common destiny. So, I think societal messages around gender, diversity, age, all of those are very important. We've seen outside of luxury, a lot of companies like Nike, for example, in the US, really capturing the cultural zeitgeist of the moment. And I think it's the role of luxury companies to, again, step up and to realize who they're selling to and what she's thinking. And she's thinking, you need to be a bit of a modern company. You can't be the old school European arrogant seller of products. You have to have values.
So, well, speaking of silver linings, do you see a silver lining when it comes to the role of stores? What do you think the role of the store is going to be when we come out of this crisis? Can the demand for luxury goods and social distancing really live in the same world?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting way to approach it, because I think, fortunately for luxury companies, stores were never really crowded. So I think social distancing is something that you've practiced, not on purpose, but just because you're selling high-ticket items. So you never really had the issue of a packed Cartier or Vuitton store, or very rarely so.
Right.
So it's not exactly like Apple, and it's not exactly like Nike. You have learned, and to be fair, pre-COVID, you already had management of flows, right? You had queues outside of luxury stores to ensure that you were serviced correctly. So I don't think social distancing is a real issue. However, more holistically, I would say that the role of the store will continue to be paramount. And I was mentioning Nike, or I can mention cosmetics as well. Nike tells investors that eventually more than half of their sales will be online, and I trust they will be. If you look at some of the cosmetics companies, already today, more than half of their business is online. I don't think that will be the case for luxury, not anytime soon. And the reason for that is, again, you are looking at a recruitment industry. You're not looking at repeat purchases. So most people who buy, Moncler, Gucci, Cartier, whatever other brand, is buying for the first time. She wants that purchase to be meaningful, and certainly it is meaningful from a price point perspective. So it's almost an investment. So if you're buying your first Cartier piece of jewelry, your first Omega watch, your first Vuitton or Gucci handbag, there's a story to tell. You know, it's not just the brand telling you a story as a consumer, it's consumers telling story between themselves. And if your story of my first branded handbag is, hey, I was online and I clicked twice and I received it after 48 hours, that's not a story. That's beyond dull, right? So I think you want to touch and feel. Again, you're spending several hundred, dollars or thousands of dollars in some cases. And the store is not just about selling. The store is the media. The store is the story. And so again, we'll talk about different stories when we will have moved to a repeat purchase market. But as long as there is predominantly recruitment in luxury, I think brick and mortar actually has great days ahead. The issue is it can't be any store. It can't be the impression of déjà vu, as the Americans say. You can't live under the illusion that you've been there before. If you go to a flagship store on Fifth Avenue, you better hope that the Soho store has nothing to do with it in terms of artwork, in terms of assortment, in terms of the way the sales associate addresses you. I think there's a lot of pressure on brands to move away from a sort of cookie cutter approach and to, again, give you the illusion that if you're going to a store in a given city or a given neighborhood, you get the impression that it's the first time you've been treated that way.
And what do you think the role of the sales associate is going to be now?
Well, I mean, she will or he will ensure that you're having a unique experience and that indeed, hopefully you'll come back. But there was a very interesting comment from the CEO of Louis Vuitton recently when he was asked, what happens when your 400 and something stores are shut? And he said, well, we actually have 12,000 stores, meaning we have 12,000 sales associates, and They are basically the face of the brand. They are what you will remember when you're back at home. That conversation, that experience, those shared experiences and shared stories is what will remain with you beyond your handbag. It's not just about product, it's about an entire environment and the time you have spent with that person to learn, to be educated, to be entertained, and to basically have an elevated experience, which again goes beyond the functionality of a watch or a handbag or something that's very pragmatic and very object driven. It's more about that relationship. And it's not exactly what you bought, it's the memory you have of it. That counts tremendously as well. So I think the role of the sales associate is not to wait behind her counter hoping that someone walks in. It's much more outgoing, it's much more interactive, it's much more it's much more active. I think the role of the sales associate is absolutely paramount, but it has to you're changing that role tremendously for the future because you need that engagement to be special.
Yeah. One of the trends you identify in Future Luxe, which we're kind of already seeing in motion, is this heightened environment and social consciousness as consumers become more thoughtful about their choices. And you talked about it a little bit before. So with the pandemic and social movements accelerating this buy less but buy better attitude, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think you are facing a younger generation of consumers who's actually asking questions. And again, in the initial phase of my first purchase, I won't be asking too many questions. I'll want to fit in with the appropriate brand or the appropriate logo to ensure that my coworkers, family members, friends, etc., recognize that I'm worthy of doing business with or worthy of a promotion, or basically worthy of being seen as potentially becoming part of the club, if you will. But then as you evolve, you're moving from buying for others and buying for fitting in purposes to buying for yourself. And again, here you'll start to ask questions in terms of how has this been produced? What is the environmental, social consequence of buying this product? What do you do with the product once its use is over? What do how are you organized as a company in terms of governance? I thought it was quite admirable to see that over the past 6 months under COVID-19 pressure, it was very difficult for brands to advertise and to push products, but they used that opportunity, that window, to do a lot of PR online and to talk about how they were repurposing production sites to produce hand sanitizers, to produce PPE, how they were giving to charity, how some were actually building hospitals in Milan, believe it or not. And again, if you talk about cultural zeitgeist, what are you doing for me? How are you giving back to the community? You can't come across as being a greedy corporate who's just there to take the money and run. You have to give back to the community. And I think a lot of the brands and groups have done very well to come across as being good corporate citizens. And talking about
LVMH was right out of the box. They acted on it immediately.
Yeah, but I mean, LVMH did a lot, Kering did a lot, Moncler, a lot of them have been front and center in terms of putting through appropriate messages to tell you as a consumer that, we understand what you're going through. We feel for you, we're going through the same, and we're trying to help. We're trying to give back. And these are super positive messages. But then, the cartoon with the different waves. You have the COVID-19 wave, and then you have the recession wave. And then the biggest wave behind you, if you thought COVID-19 was an issue, is the climate change wave. And so indeed, this young, Gen Z or selfie generation, or however you want to call them, they are asking questions also in terms of how are you producing this? Are you selling secondhand? What is the life cycle of the product? Tell me about circularity. And for a lot of these questions, brands don't really have a set up solution, but they better get their act together soon, because there are very few people asking these questions, but they are more vocal than most, and they will be more influential than most. And as more consumers come online to this sector, I think these issues will become front and center.
Yeah, last year, 32 fashion companies, including the pillars of the world's luxury fashion market, Chanel, Ralph Lauren, and Prada, among them, they announced they were signing this fashion pact, this non-legally binding agreement to combat greenhouse gases and emphasize sustainability in industry. So how important was that industry pact in turning a niche concern into a real movement?
I think it was quite important, all the more so as it was run by Kering. And Kering, as you probably know, the global head of sustainability at Kering is on the executive committee. I think the CEO of Kering, takes sustainability issues not as a sort of box-ticking exercise, but as being embedded in everything they do. And so looking at an ePNL, environmental PNL, for all the different brands, and they actually mean it. And I think the fact that you had initially, I think to your point, 32 brands or groups, and now you have more actually joining the bandwagon, I think it's a sort of systems of balances and checks. To your point, it's not binding, but you have a sort of moral obligation of trying to be reasonable. And you've had some articles, and you even had a book called Fashionopolis. I'm not here to advertise other people's books, but I think it was quite meaningful in terms of the fashion industry being one of the most pollutive on the planet. This is starting to go out there. This is starting to affect consumers who are thinking about it twice and thinking, if I'm looking at fast fashion and I'm buying an article of ready to wear and I'll wear it 3 times and then I'll ditch it, what does that do for the planet? What does it mean about me? What am I projecting to peers? Is this reasonable? So you want to live under the illusion that, not every product will be like a Patek Philippe that you'll, transmit to the next generation. But if you can have that type of approach, or if you can have a sort of Patagonia approach where, products can be repaired or products can be traded in and used for other consumers, that will expand the life expectancy of that product. These are really positive messages. So I think gradually everyone is, waking up to the new realities of what consumers need and fundamentally what the planet needs, and behaving accordingly. So, it's not one initiative in isolation, but clearly the Fashion Pact, I think, has made decision-making more visible, has made a lot of companies engage, and it's certainly a great thing.
In the book, you interview several CEOs from some of the largest groups and brands, including Kering, Cartier, Puma, and Moncler. And one that kind of stuck out with me was Remo Ruffini, the chairman and CEO of Moncler, talks about luxury goods sector evolving. And he says in the book, clients need to feel part of a community and companies need to be ready to explore new ways of thinking, continuously delivering newness and using the language of digital, in particular with the youngest ones. And Moncler is one of those brands that has quickly, and to my opinion, smartly pivoted to meet this new generation of luxury buyers. I think like 40% of Moncler's customer base, Gen Z and millennials, and I think it's even higher among their Genius Collection customers. Mm-hmm. So what do brands like Moncler and Gucci and Vuitton understand about the Gen Z customer?
So first of all, I think they understood and they were quite surprised at how much the young generation connects to luxury. 4 or 5 years ago, you had comments from people saying, oh, the new generation will move away from luxury because they have other interests. And it's exactly the opposite that occurred, i.e., again, this selfie generation is quite obsessed with its image, the perception on social media, and brands are at the center of their lives to a certain extent. But beyond that, and beyond what we mentioned around values and purpose and the environment and basically giving back to the community, I think what Moncler understood more than anyone, but you're right to also mention Gucci and Vuitton because you're seeing that for those two brands as well, is the entertainment value. No one needs luxury, but luxury needs to put a smile on your face. Luxury needs to surprise you. Luxury is the little things in your day that makes that day way better. And so you were mentioning the Genius project, very difficult project to implement. If you think about the tensions in terms of design, production, marketing, retail, essentially the Genius project is to institutionalize collaborations, not on a 2 to 3 year basis, but on a monthly basis. Basically, the idea is if you go past a shopping window display at Moncler on a monthly basis, you'll have something that will surprise you. You might love it, you might hate it, doesn't really matter actually, it'll jump out at you. You cannot go past that shopping window display and not notice it. And so I think this idea of surprise and delight, this idea of, you've had horrible words being thrown out there like retailtainment, the idea that you're walking around a shopping mall or you're walking in a high street and suddenly something puts a smile on your face, something surprises you, something basically enlightens your day. That's part of the mission of these luxury brands. And it's certainly what the younger consumer will resonate with. Give me something to write home about. Give me something that even if it's for a very short period of time, give me something that puts a smile on my face. And I think that entertainment value, that surprise and delight approach, I think Moncler absolutely nailed it with the Genius collection. The difficulty now is once you've moved from collaborations being, every other year to every month, I'm not sure what the next stage is, because the amount of pressure it puts on teams to be that creative on such a regular basis is just tremendous. But clearly no one has followed suit, right? Because it's quite unique what they managed to pull off.
Yeah, I recently had Jeff Carvalho, who's the co-founder of High Snobiety, on the show. And we talked about how streetwear culture has moved to mainstream over the course of the last decade, and it's led to this luxury streetwear. So what do you think the underlying forces that merged those two together to make it bigger than ever? And do you think streetwear will continue to influence luxury fashion?
Absolutely, especially as, Gen Z was, maybe 9% of the world population in 2016, will be 30% of the population by 2030. Casualization, sneakerization, as some media have called it, which again, another horrible word, but the idea is the younger generation is not dressing in the same way that we were or are, depending. And, I often have the question from people saying, this trend in sportswear, for example, the Nikes and Adidas's and Pumas of this world, can the growth continue after this super cycle of growth that we've been through for the past 10 years? Well, it's not a super cycle of growth. It is a generational shift. It's just the way people dress these days. And honestly, COVID-19, again, if a lot of us have been forced to stay at home, and we've been basically, on Zoom and watching yoga tutorials
Right.
And buying Lululemon and those types of brands. I don't think that's going to help in becoming more formal in the way we dress. So I think you still have streetwear having a lot of potential. It doesn't work for every brand. So typically, within the Kering group, you might think that it's a great boost for Balenciaga. It's probably not adapted for Saint Laurent. Saint Laurent streetwear casualization is not part of their DNA, and that's fine. It's not going to be adapted to every brand on the planet. But certainly, I don't think it's going to disappear tomorrow. And you've seen recent collaborations between Dior and Nike, which again tells the consumers of Dior that it's a cool brand because Nike's a cool brand, but also Nike, as I was mentioning, is pretty much front and center with the whole Black Lives Matter debate in the US. And, with the association, Dior is also embracing some societal change in the US, and that can't be a bad thing. So I don't think that you'll see streetwear evaporating in terms of relevance anytime soon.
Well, let's pivot to the weed business. And I figured now is as good a time as any to switch gears a little bit. So weed is a booming industry in the U.S., and we're already seeing dispensaries that look like Apple stores, $1,000 sculptural water pipes being sold at Barney's when it was open, cannabis packed in cut crystal decanters, vape pens designed with executives in mind. And among your book's insights into the next decade, you mentioned that sellers of luxury handbags, shoes, and watches will face stiff competition from a new breed of upmarket goods, including cannabis.
Yeah. So what I would say is it's a substitute in terms of share of wallet. Obviously it's cannabis is not accepted from a federal point of view in the U.S. for now. It's state by state. It is federally accepted in some markets like Canada and a few other markets around the world. I think the day luxury moves from being all about recruitment to being about replacement or repeat purchases, then yes, you will have a lot of substitutes, of which cannabis. Now, the substitute in the sense of, if you go to Denver in Colorado, or if you go to LA, you will have high-end streets where you will have cannabis and traditional luxury competing for space, i.e. locations, competing for staff, and competing for your wallet. And if you're in the market of my first handbag, well, other premiumization of other subsectors of which cannabis will not be an issue. But if you are a repeat purchaser, i.e. you already own 2 to 3 or more handbags, then yes, it starts to come into play. And I wouldn't limit it to cannabis. Actually, you can look at clubs, you can look at gyms, you can look at coffee. You've had the example of roasteries at Starbucks, right, where again, you're looking for a unique experience and it's uniquely priced for it. There are a lot of subsectors where you will have a super premium version of that sector, which again will take away from incremental luxury purchases. So for me, yeah, if you look at locations, if you look at staff, so talent basically, and if you look at share of wallet, cannabis can be a substitute like a lot of other subsectors in the longer term.
Yeah, I think you also mentioned that health and wellness is one of those sectors which cut across a bunch of categories like beauty and fashion and travel and fitness all go under that health and wellness umbrella. And it's really a super fast growing segment that accelerated during the pandemic. And, affluent consumers are willing to pay premium for these perceived wellness solutions. So your feeling is like cannabis, money that consumers would normally spend on traditional luxury products could be reallocated to the luxury of sound mind and body.
Yeah, no, I think health, you've had comments around health is the new wealth. And clearly in some markets where it's either costly or complicated to be protected in case you become sick. And, the US is one of those countries. I think you've had, again, a bit of a wake-up call thinking, I should probably have a more balanced life. The pandemic has been an eye-opener. And people have probably been thinking, I better stay fit. I better watch out in terms of what I'm eating. Maybe I need to have a better sleep routine. Maybe I need to practice yoga. Maybe I need to practice meditation. I mean, if you look at meditation apps, they're not exactly free, and they are actually recruiting. Stars, Matthew McConaughey, John McEnroe,
Right.
whoever will help you to fall asleep. It sounds nuts, but the reality is people will pay up for well-being. People will pay up to literally sleep at night better.
So do you think,
In very stressful times.
so do you think the value proposition of luxury brands will have to expand to include emotional experiences that reduce anxiety, focus on wellness, be entertaining, and have more of this therapeutic value? Do you
Yeah,
think traditional luxury players need to integrate those elements?
I think gradually they have to take into account a more holistic approach to the consumer. I think it is to a certain extent the role of LVMH as the sort of proxy for the sector because it's so big to redefine what luxury needs to be. And to be fair, recent acquisitions from LVMH, if you look at Belmond, which is basically hospitality hotels, if you look at Rimowa, which is basically luggage, travel and hospitality, which in hindsight, I mean, it's quite easy to say today in hindsight that the timing of these two acquisitions wasn't great, but who knew that COVID-19 was coming, right? But, once the world reopens, appetite for travel will come back. Appetite for, a stay at an exceptional location, a great hotel or a Michelin star restaurant. Yeah, these are substitutes to my next handbag or my next, piece of jewelry. And certainly, for LVMH to invest in those areas, you've had a few eyebrows being raised, but it's completely logical. I mean, the mission of LVMH and other groups for that matter is to basically tap into your wallet as a wealthy consumer. They can tap into your wallet with everything with the possible exception of an iPhone or a Samsung phone. I don't think there's any limit. I don't think you should put any limit on how much they can tap into upper middle class wallets. The sky's the limit to a certain extent. If you see that, consumers on the high end are going towards more real estate or more travel or more hospitality, then, follow the money.
So let's talk about the diamond elephant in the room. That's Tiffany and LVMH. So Tiffany just, every day there's something else. So Tiffany just fast-tracked the lawsuit against LVMH. So what do you think will happen when the legal dust settles?
I mean, I think so. First of all, if you look at the relevance of the deal, I still think acquiring a jewelry company makes a lot of sense. Again, if you trust that the future is female, that jewelry is a very fragmented market, that there are very few sizable brands out there. And if also you consider the phenomenal track record that LVMH has had with Bulgari since they bought that brand in 2011, it's, the validity of the approach is still very much there.
Plus it draws them closer to Richemont.
Yeah, I mean, there are, you could argue there might be two possibilities. One, the bid that LVMH made on Tiffany was pre-COVID, and then they had to increase that bid, and maybe they're thinking, well, post-COVID, maybe we should get a better, a better deal. You could argue that, if you're thinking for the next generation, if you look at the market cap of Tiffany relative to the market cap of LVMH, it's a bit of a rounding error. So, getting a discount on a rounding error is a bit of a rounding error squared, if I can say. So it won't make a huge difference. Or, yeah, I mean, to your point, people have mentioned that maybe there's a possibility that LVMH is looking to switch brides. So, moving out of the Tiffany deal to potentially look to set something up with Richemont. Honestly, I don't really have insights on that. Obviously, Richemont is a much larger company, much more, much bigger in terms of the number of assets, with the Cartier brand being the sort of crown jewel, if I can say. Not significantly bigger than Tiffany, but a lot more profitable for now. And so, yeah, I think we'll still be talking about this in 6 months. Nothing's going to, well, I would be very surprised if you had a resolution in the short term. Mm-hmm. But again, the validity of, jewelry is a sort of compounding growth industry, a very fragmented industry, and one that you want to have some skin in the game in. That's still completely valid.
So what do you think Tiffany's future will look like if the deal falls through?
Well, I mean, whether the deal goes ahead or whether it falls through for different reasons, I think whatever happens, you'll have an acceleration in terms of consolidation. So you have very big brands that are independent and don't need anyone's help. You can think about, Hermes, Chanel, Rolex. Then you have very small brands, independent brands that might need help. I think Tiffany is somewhere in the middle, in the sense that they're not a mega brand. They're not 8 to 10 billion in sales. They're at around 4, and they're not tiny either. So I think, no pun intended, I think Tiffany, if this deal doesn't go through, will have the luxury of being able to remain independent, or can have options, to tie up with others. But again, whether this goes through or not, LVMH started decades ago as LV and MH, essentially 3 assets. Now they have 76. The end game, or at least the next 10 years, will have them go from 76 to anywhere between 90 and 100. And whether Tiffany's one of those, anyone's guess at this stage, because to your point, there's something new happening every day.
Yeah.
But certainly consolidation that has been, M&A that has been incredibly active in the sector for the past decade will be incredibly active once the world opens up next year, hopefully for the next decade.
There's a museum exhibition opening in Paris this month, explores how all things luxe have evolved over the centuries. And luxury as a concept has always seemed inherently rooted in materialism. So the question of the day is, what is a life of luxury now?
I still think, because the Chinese consumer is front and center, I still think it is about products. I still think that for the next 5-10 years, it's going to be initially about your place in society and fitting in, and symbols. And symbols, to be fair, right now translates into logos. Logos, whether it's obvious on a handbag or whether it's more discreet on a ring. We were just talking about Tiffany. One of the recent successes at Tiffany has been the T1 range, which is very obviously recognizable at a distance. If you're in a bar and a restaurant, or, likelihood is you're not today, but if you're walking in the street at a distance, you can recognize that that's a Tiffany product. So I think in the short term, it's still going to be about things. But eventually, again, when we move to more of a repeat purchase market, and you're moving from buying for yourself to, buying for others to buying for yourself, then I think it'll be more about experiences. It'll be more about education, learning, and discovering the world, less through material elements than through reading or traveling, or again, continuing to learn every day. I think that's what it can morph into.
Which leads me to my last question, which I ask all my guests. The final question is the luxury item question. If you were stranded on a deserted island and you only had one luxury item, what luxury item would that be? It can't be any form of air transportation, or any transportation for that matter, or anything that requires mobile service. What would that one single luxury item be?
So, well, presumably I would be alone on my island, so I wouldn't need to prove a point. So I probably wouldn't need to have like the latest, cool shoes or bag or watch or piece of jewelry. Going back to the idea of learning and education, I would probably, I took a course in wine recently, again, because I needed to exercise my memory. I think it's fun. I think wine is an infinite world, in terms of you never get to understand it fully, and it's right. Obviously it was very convenient ahead of COVID-19 hitting to be able to taste wine in a different approach. So I would probably buy a book on wine and continue to learn, and hoping that someone would come and save me, and that immediately after reading about Australian Shiraz or Barolo or whatever else, that I would be able to sample that as soon as I'm off my island.
Or that message in a bottle that washes ashore is actually a bottle of Chardonnay. So how can listeners buy Future Luxe?
You can order it from your local bookstore. You can obviously order it on Amazon. You also have the Kindle version there if you're less into material, hard products. So it's pretty easy to access.
Erwan, thank you so much for coming on the show. You've been a great guest. And the great thing is you're letting us know that we should be hopeful about the next decade in luxury, and we need more of that positivity.
Thanks for having me. Wish you all the best.
That's it for this episode of the Luxury Item Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this useful and entertaining, I would be really grateful if you can share it with a friend or colleague. I would love it if you subscribe so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. The Luxury Item Podcast is a production of Silvertone Consulting. I'm your host, Scott Kerr. Until next time.